Okay, so are you ready for a deep dive into something that might seem like a blast from the past?
Well, asbestos.
Asbestos.
Yeah, I know, right? I know what you're thinking. Asbestos. Isn't that old news? Right. Well, that's kind of what I thought too, you know? Until a few months ago, I was helping a friend clean out their grandparents' attic. And,
Oh, no.
yeah, let's just say I'm really glad we were wearing masks. And I'm never looking at old insulation the same way again.
I can imagine.
It really hit me then, just how much of this stuff is still out there, hiding in plain sight. And that's where we're really going to go deep on this one.
Okay.
We've got a whole stack of sources for this deep dive. A WHO fact sheet, some medical journal articles, even a workplace safety guide from the EU. Wow, that's a great range of perspectives. What I find fascinating about asbestos is that it's a naturally occurring mineral, We're not talking about some synthetic chemical concoction here. These are fibers found in nature. And for a long time, they were actually prized for their strength and heat resistance.
So, like, what were they actually used for?
Oh, all sorts of things. The most common type, chrysotile, it was everywhere. Building insulation, floor tiles, brake pads, even in some types of cement. And sadly, the very properties that made it so useful also make it incredibly dangerous to our health.
Which is where the silent threat part comes in, right?
Mhm.
Because it's not like you breathe this stuff in and immediately keel over.
Exactly. These microscopic fibers are easily inhaled, but once they're lodged in your lungs, imagine like shards of glass embedding themselves in delicate tissue. Over time, that irritation and scarring can lead to a whole host of problems, including lung cancer.
And it's not just lung cancer either, right? I mean, some of the statistics we found from the World Health Organization, those are pretty terrifying.
Yeah. Over 200,000 deaths globally each year are attributed to occupational asbestos exposure alone. That accounts for 70%, staggering 70% of all work-related cancer deaths.
Crazy.
It is. And then you have larynx cancer, ovarian cancer, and mesothelioma, which is a particularly aggressive cancer of the lining of the lungs, all directly linked to asbestos exposure.
So this isn't just a concern for people who work in shipyards or construction like we might assume, right?
Exactly. While occupational exposure is a major issue, our sources really highlight how widespread the risks truly are, especially when we start talking about legacy asbestos.
Okay, so legacy asbestos, that sounds kind of like something out of a history book. What
Yeah.
is that exactly?
Well, it refers to asbestos-containing materials found in buildings constructed before stricter regulations were put in place. So, think homes, schools, offices built before the 1980s.
Oh, okay.
These buildings can become hazardous, particularly as they age, and those materials begin to deteriorate.
So we're talking about things like insulation around pipes or like old floor tiles, that popcorn ceiling texture that was all the rage back in the day.
Precisely.
Stuff that I feel like most of us have probably encountered at some point.
Right. And as these materials age, they can become brittle and release those microscopic asbestos fibers into the air. Oh, wow.
And, it's not always obvious. You might think it takes like major demolition to release those fibers, but even something as simple as, drilling a hole in the wall
Right.
or sanding down a textured ceiling, that can actually pose a risk if those materials are disturbed.
And it's not just homes either. One of our sources, the 2023 Comprehensive Asbestos Report, it kind of paints a pretty bleak picture when it comes to schools.
Yeah, it's a major concern.
Mhm.
The report estimates that over 50 million students and 7 million staff across the U.S. are potentially exposed to asbestos in their schools.
Wow.
And remember, children are especially vulnerable because their bodies are still developing.
It's pretty unsettling to think about, honestly. I mean, you send your kids to school, you expect them to be safe, and you have this hidden danger potentially lurking in the walls. It really highlights the importance of awareness and proactive measures. Do you know if your home or your child's school has been tested for asbestos? This isn't something to put on the back burner.
Yeah, you're right. Definitely worth looking into. And, speaking of unexpected sources of exposure, our materials also touch on something I hadn't really considered before: natural disasters.
It's a growing concern. Think about what happens during a hurricane, an earthquake, even a major wildfire. Buildings are damaged or destroyed, and that can release asbestos fibers into the air, contaminating the surrounding environment.
Right.
The 2023 report actually cites the recent earthquake in Turkey as a prime example of this.
So it's not even just the immediate danger of collapsing structures. It's this, like, invisible threat that lingers long after the disaster itself.
Exactly. And these fibers can travel vast distances in the wind, potentially exposing communities far beyond the disaster zone.
Wow.
We're talking about contaminated soil, water sources, the air we breathe. The long-term consequences are incredibly difficult to fully grasp.
It's a stark reminder of how interconnected everything is. Okay, so we've covered the basics of asbestos, the health risks, some of the more common ways people are exposed, but some of the medical journals you pulled actually dive into some less known but equally concerning potential health impacts.
Yes, and this is where the research gets really interesting. We're talking about a possible link between asbestos exposure and autoimmune diseases.
Autoimmune diseases. See, that's not something that I would have immediately associated with asbestos. Explain that connection for me.
Well, it's a relatively new area of study, but some compelling evidence is emerging. One of our sources, a study titled Risk Factors Associated with Asbestos-Related Diseases, a community-based case control study, focuses on a town called Libby, Montana. Have you heard of it?
It rings a bell. I'm drawing a blank on why, though.
Libby has this tragic history with asbestos. For decades, a nearby mine produced vermiculite, which is a mineral that's often contaminated with asbestos, and this mine released massive amounts of asbestos fibers into the environment, essentially blanketing the town and surrounding areas in this toxic dust.
So this study was looking at the long-term health effects on the people of Libby.
Exactly. And they were particularly interested in understanding the link between environmental asbestos exposure. Remember, these fibers were everywhere, not just in the mine itself, and the development of autoimmune diseases.
And what did they find?
The results were pretty startling. The study found a strong correlation between environmental asbestos exposure in Libby and a higher incidence of autoimmune diseases like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis.
So we're talking about diseases where the body's own immune system starts attacking healthy tissues and organs.
Yes. And while more research is needed to definitively prove a causal link, the findings from Libby are hard to ignore. They suggest that asbestos exposure, even at low levels over an extended period, could potentially trigger these debilitating autoimmune conditions.
Wow, that is heavy stuff. To think it might be linked to these chronic, often sort of invisible illnesses too. It really adds another layer of concern, doesn't it?
It does, and it highlights the fact that we're still learning about the full impact of asbestos exposure, honestly. This is why that Libby study is so crucial. It raises more questions, certainly, but it also pushes us to think beyond the more, well-known asbestos-related diseases.
So given everything we've learned, what's the outlook? Is there any good news here? I'm hoping our pile of research has some, hopeful nuggets for us.
Well, there is some encouraging news on the regulatory front. According to the World Health Organization, over 50 countries have now completely banned asbestos.
No.
Our EU Workplace Safety Guide, it actually mentions that the EU banned all new asbestos use back in 2005.
Okay, that's a solid step in the right direction.
Yeah.
But what about here in the U.S.? I know we've had some near bans and legal battles and all that over the years. What's the current status?
So the 2023 Comprehensive Asbestos Report goes into this in detail. The U.S. EPA did attempt to ban asbestos back in 1989. However, that ban was overturned in court.
Oh, really? Yeah, after facing strong opposition from industry groups.
So classic case of profits being put ahead of public health then.
Unfortunately, yeah, that's often how these things play out. The report does mention that the EPA proposed a new rule in 2022.
Okay.
This time specifically targeting crucityl asbestos, which, as we discussed, is the most widely used type. But this new rule is still under review.
Let's hope this time it actually goes through, because it's kind of frustrating that we're still having this conversation in 2024.
I agree. However, even amidst the regulatory back and forth, there have been some positive shifts within the industry itself.
Oh, okay.
The report highlights several companies in the chlor-alkali industry, including major players like Olin Corporation and Westlake, that have voluntarily chosen to phase out their use of asbestos. That's huge. I mean, if companies are choosing to move away from it even without being legally required to, that signals a real turning point, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And the report actually quotes Scott Sutton, the CEO of Olin Corporation, as saying, "We are supporting the end of the use of asbestos in our industry." That kind of statement from a major industry leader carries a lot of weight.
It does. It does give you some hope for the future, but knowing that so much legacy asbestos is still out there, it feels like this is a problem that isn't going away anytime soon.
You're right. And that's why knowledge is so crucial. Even if we achieve, a total ban on asbestos tomorrow, the legacy of its use will continue to impact us for generations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important thing our listeners should take away from all this? What's the, call to action, so to speak?
If there's one message I want to leave you with, it's this. Don't wait for regulations or someone else to solve this problem for you, you know? Be proactive. Educate yourself about the potential risks of asbestos in your own environment and take steps to protect yourself and your loved ones.
Couldn't agree more. Knowledge really is power, especially when it comes to a silent threat like asbestos. We've only scratched the surface here, but hopefully this deep dive has given you the information you need to ask the right questions and make informed decisions.
And remember, there are resources available to help you navigate this issue. Don't hesitate to reach out to qualified professionals for testing, inspection, or if you have any concerns about potential asbestos exposure at all.
Excellent advice. Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this dunk dive into the hidden dangers of asbestos. Stay safe out there, everyone.